In this picture, the eyes move, and no matter where you go, they follow. Clara had never believed in curses. She wasn't the type to read horoscopes or buy dream catchers from thrift stores, and she certainly didn't think her family carried any kind of supernatural burden. But when the lawyer handed her the old brass key to her grandmother's storage unit, something inside her shifted. A chill, like the air had thickened around her shoulders. Her grandmother, a woman Clara barely knew, had died 2 weeks earlier in a quiet nursing home in Maine. The rest of the family hadn't wanted to deal with her things, so the responsibility fell to Clara, the responsible granddaughter, the one who always said yes even when she should have said no. The storage unit smelled of rust and mothballs, the faint, suffocating scent of things that had been locked away for too long. Dust motes floated like tiny ghosts in the strip of sunlight from the half-open door. Clara expected boxes of old dresses, maybe yellowed newspapers or chipped porcelain. Instead, at the very center of the unit, sat a single trunk, large, wooden and heavy-looking, with iron bands across its surface. It looked like it belonged in the corner of a pirate ship, not in a dull concrete storage room. Carved into its lid were strange swirling patterns that almost resembled eyes if you stared too long. She dragged it into the light, coughing at the dust that rose from its surface, and slid the brass key into the lock. It turned with a sound that was too loud, too final, echoing in the unit like the closing of a door behind her. Inside, wrapped carefully in brittle cloth, were photographs. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, stacked neatly, their sepia tones and black and white shades hinting at decades long gone. There were portraits of stern men in suspenders, women in lace collars, children with solemn expressions. None of them smiled. None of them looked happy. Their faces seemed sharp, intense, the kind of images that made your stomach twist, though you couldn't explain why. Clara lifted one at random. A woman stood beside a farmhouse, hands folded primly, eyes staring straight into the camera. But the longer Clara held it, the more she felt like the woman's gaze wasn't fixed on the photographer. It was fixed on her. She set it back down quickly, telling herself it was just her imagination. Yet when she picked up another, she felt it again. The eyes, not just looking out of the photograph, looking at her. She shivered and tried to laugh it off. Maybe her grandmother had been a photography enthusiast. Maybe these were just forgotten relics. Still, something made her tuck the first handful of photos into her bag and leave the trunk locked behind her. She told herself she'd sort through them later, maybe even sell a few to collectors. Old photos were valuable sometimes, weren't they? That night, in her small Boston apartment, Clara spread the photographs across her kitchen table. The lamplight flickered as if the bulb was about to die, and the air felt colder than usual. She picked up the photo of the woman by the farmhouse again. Her eyes, dark, piercing, seemed sharper now, as though the picture had shifted in detail since the afternoon. Clara frowned, tilting the photo toward the light. For the briefest moment, she swore she saw the woman blink. She dropped the photo onto the table, heart pounding. "No," Clara muttered under her breath. "No. I'm overtired. I'm seeing things." But the photographs wouldn't let her look away. Each face seemed alive in its own way. A boy with slicked back hair, a man with a wide hat, a girl clutching a doll. Their eyes carried weight, a strange intensity that made Clara's skin prickle. She flipped them face down, telling herself she needed sleep. At 2:14 a.m., Clara woke with a start. The apartment was silent except for the hum of her fridge. She didn't know why she'd woken, but her eyes fell immediately to the floor beside her bed. There, resting neatly against the carpet, was the photograph of the woman by the farmhouse. Clara's breath hitched. She was certain she had left that photo on the kitchen table, flipped upside down. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. The woman's face stared back at her, only this time, the angle was different. She wasn't standing by the farmhouse anymore. She was closer, as though she had stepped toward the camera. Her lips seemed curled into the faintest suggestion of a smile. Clara dropped the photograph and stumbled back against her bed frame. She couldn't breathe. Her rational mind screamed for explanations. Maybe she had accidentally brought it with her. Maybe her exhaustion was making her hallucinate. But none of it made sense. She forced herself to pick the photo up again, heart hammering so loud she could hear it in her ears. The woman's eyes seemed to follow her now, no matter where she moved in the room. When Clara set the picture on her nightstand and stepped left, the woman's gaze shifted left. When she stepped right, the eyes followed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was real. She didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Instead, she sat with every light in the apartment switched on, the photograph turned face down, her body trembling with unease. She tried to tell herself she was imagining things, that grief for her grandmother was manifesting in strange ways. But when dawn finally broke, Clara noticed something else that made her blood run cold. The rest of the photographs, every single one she had left on her kitchen table, were now stacked neatly on her nightstand. All of them, as though someone, or something, had carried them into her room while she slept. Clara couldn't bring herself to throw the photographs away. It would have been the simplest solution. Just gather the stack, march them down to the dumpster behind her building, and forget they ever existed. But something about them wouldn't let her. Every time she reached for the pile, her chest tightened, her fingers turned clammy, and a low, instinctive dread churned in her gut, as if the photographs themselves were warning her not to. By morning, she had convinced herself that exhaustion had warped her senses, that what she saw last night, the blinking, the shifting positions, the eyes that followed her, had all been some fever dream of a mind on edge. Still, the unease clung to her like smoke. She shoved the photos into the trunk of her car before heading to work, telling herself she'd leave them in the office storage closet until she figured out what to do. But as she pulled out of her driveway, she caught a glimpse in her rearview mirror. The woman by the farmhouse, her pale face peering up at her from the top of the stack, the faint curl of her lips suggesting triumph. Clara almost swerved. At the marketing firm where she worked, the day dragged like wet cloth. She sat at her desk, typing emails, designing ad campaigns, forcing herself to be normal while her mind kept circling back to the trunk of photographs in her car. At lunch, her coworker Rachel noticed the dark circles under her eyes. "Clara, are you okay? You look exhausted." Clara forced a smile, but when Rachel pressed further, Clara finally whispered about the photos. She told her how they seemed strange, how the eyes felt alive. Rachel chuckled and waved it off. "You're spooking yourself. Old photos are creepy, sure, but they're just pictures. Bring them in, I'll prove it." Reluctantly, Clara fetched one, the boy with the slicked-back hair. She handed it to Rachel across the cafeteria table, bracing herself for the moment when Rachel would see what she had seen. But Rachel only studied the photo for a moment, brow furrowing. "It's just a kid. A little unnerving, yeah, but nothing weird." Clara leaned forward, her pulse racing. "Don't you see it? His eyes. They move." Rachel laughed. "Girl, you need sleep, seriously. No more horror movies before bed." But even as Rachel teased her, Clara's gaze stayed fixed on the boy in the photo. His pupils seemed darker now, rounder, the light catching in them just a little too sharply. Rachel didn't see it, but Clara did. It was subtle, nearly invisible. But the boy's eyes shifted slightly when Rachel set the photo back down on the table. They had flicked toward Clara. By the time Clara returned home that evening, her nerves were frayed raw. She told herself she would not touch the photos again. She would lock them in her closet and pretend they weren't there. But as she set down her bag and walked into the living room, her stomach dropped. Every photograph she had left in the car, every single one, was scattered across her coffee table, spread out neatly as though someone had arranged them while she was gone. Her car trunk was empty. The keys were still in her purse. Panic clawed up her throat.
She forced herself closer, each step heavy. The faces stared back at her, expressionless, yet their eyes were wrong. The woman from the farmhouse no longer stood in the distance. She was now at the very edge of the frame, as though pressing against the invisible wall of the photograph, her face looming larger, her faint smile deepening. The boy with the slicked back hair appeared closer too, his doll-like stare sharper, more intense. Clara swept the photos into a pile with shaking hands, slamming them back into their box and shoving it into her closet, her breath ragged. But as the night deepened, the unease only grew. At 11:47 p.m., Clara sat on her couch with the TV on, desperately clinging to the background chatter of late-night commercials, when something moved at the edge of her vision. She turned to the window. At first, she thought it was a reflection, a trick of the street lamp. But no, the figure was outside. A woman's silhouette standing utterly still on the sidewalk below, head tilted up toward Clara's apartment window. Clara's heart seized. The figure didn't move, didn't wave, didn't walk away. Just stood, watching. She scrambled for her phone, dialing Rachel. "Someone's outside," Clara whispered, her voice breaking. "Someone's watching me." Rachel's groggy voice on the other end tried to soothe her, suggesting it was a random passerby. But Clara's shaking hand pulled the blinds wider, and the words died in her throat. The woman on the sidewalk wasn't just any woman. It was her, the same woman from the farmhouse photograph, the same pale face, the same old-fashioned dress. Even from 3 stories up, Clara could see her expression, the faint, knowing smile. Clara dropped the phone. She stumbled back, clutching the curtain closed, chest heaving like a trapped animal. When she dared to peek again, the street below was empty. But the moment she turned, her knees nearly buckled. The photograph of the farmhouse woman lay neatly on her couch cushion. And now, she wasn't outside a farmhouse at all. She was standing on a sidewalk. The very same sidewalk Clara's apartment overlooked. Clara's scream tore through the silence.
Clara barely slept. The scream she let out last night still echoed in her skull, raw and hollow, even hours later. Every time she closed her eyes, she imagined that pale figure beneath her window, staring, smiling, waiting. Morning sunlight did little to ease her dread. Her apartment felt wrong, heavier somehow, as though someone else's breath lingered in the air. She could not bear to look at the photographs again, but she could feel them through the closet door, waiting for her like coiled snakes in the dark. By noon, she forced herself to leave the apartment. She needed answers, not excuses. She needed to understand why her grandmother, a woman she barely knew, had left her such a terrifying burden. The logical place to start was her grandmother's house, the crumbling old home in Maine that had been sold off to strangers after her death. Clara had avoided it during the funeral, but now the thought gnawed at her. If anyone knew the truth, it would be hidden there. The drive up the coast was long and gray. Rain streaked her windshield in diagonal lines, and the highway stretched endlessly, trees leaning inward as though they wanted to shut out the light. Clara gripped the wheel tighter than she realized, her knuckles white. Every time she blinked, she imagined the photographs in her closet, those faces inching closer, pressing harder against their frozen prisons. And she couldn't shake the memory of the farmhouse woman outside her window. Clara had grown up in the suburbs, surrounded by convenience stores and traffic lights. Yet she knew with a sick certainty that the dress, the hairstyle, the sharp, hollow cheeks of that figure were not of her time. When she finally pulled up to the house, it was smaller than she remembered, slouching under the weight of its own history. The shutters sagged, the paint peeled in long strips, and ivy clung stubbornly to its brick chimney. The new owners hadn't moved in yet. Through the dusty windows, the room sat in darkness, but the house radiated a strange familiarity, as though it had been waiting for her return. Clara shivered, unlocking the front with the spare key she had begged from the realtor under the pretense of collecting old family keepsakes. The interior smelled of mildew and forgotten time. Wooden floors creaked beneath her boots. She walked through the room slowly, feeling the ghost of her grandmother in every shadow. Upstairs, the master bedroom held an old wardrobe and a vanity coated in dust. Clara opened drawers one by one until she found something, An envelope tucked beneath a stack of brittle handkerchiefs. Her name, written in delicate cursive, spread across the front. Clara. Her hands trembled as she tore it open. Inside was a letter. If you are reading this, it means the photographs have found you. I'm sorry, child. I could not stop them, only delay them. They have been in our family for generations, passed down like a sickness. Your grandfather was the first to bring them here. He said they were art, but he was wrong. They are not art, they are traps. Do not stare too long into their eyes. Do not let them into your home. And above all,
Clara's
do not let them
hammered.
take your picture. The words swam before her eyes, her mouth dry. She read the letter again and again, clinging to each line. A sickness passed through the family. Photographs as traps? It sounded like lunacy. But hadn't she already seen proof? She flipped the letter over, hoping for more answers. At the bottom, in hurried script, her grandmother had scrawled, "The name you must remember is Silas Garrison, photographer 1923. He believed he could steal eternity. He believed souls belonged on film. He was not wrong." Clara sat frozen, the rain tapping softly against the window pane. Silas Garrison, a name that meant nothing to her, yet it set her teeth on edge, a vibration of dread running through her chest. She pulled out her phone and searched it, her fingers shaking. At first, nothing came up. Then, on an obscure local history website, she found him. Silas Garrison, a photographer who operated briefly in rural Maine in the 1920s before being arrested for unlawful practices and grave desecration. The article was short, vague, but one line stuck with her like a thorn. Authorities claimed his photographs of the deceased were unusually vivid, even lifelike. Many believed he did not capture images at all, but something far worse. Clara snapped her laptop shut, bile rising in her throat. She suddenly understood the faces in the photographs, the boy, the farmhouse woman, the children with their vacant eyes. They weren't family portraits, they were souls. Trapped, stolen, frozen into film by a man who thought himself an artist. And somehow, those cursed prints had followed her grandmother, survived her grandfather, and now they were with Clara. The floor creaked behind her. Clara spun, her heart leaping into her mouth. No one was there. Just the empty hallway, the whisper of rain against the glass. But she knew she hadn't imagined it. Slowly, she stepped toward the sound. The bedroom door, which she was sure had been shut, now hung open. Beyond it, in the dimness, a shape leaned against the wall. Clara blinked and her stomach dropped. It was a photograph, a framed portrait she had never seen before. The farmhouse woman again, standing closer than ever, her smile wider, sharper, cruel. Clara's hands shook as she reached for the frame. The glass was ice cold. And then, so faint she thought she was losing her mind, a whisper pressed against her ear, though the lips in the portrait never moved. Closer. Clara dropped the frame and stumbled back, the whisper coiling in her skull like smoke. Her grandmother's warning screamed in her head. Do not stare too long into their eyes. But her gaze was drawn against her will, the farmhouse woman's pupils widening, swallowing her vision. She tore herself away, bolting down the stairs, slamming the front door shut behind her. Rain soaked her hair, her clothes. But she didn't care. She sprinted to her car, clutching the letter, shoving the key into the ignition with trembling hands. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. All she knew was that if she stayed another second in that house, she would never leave alive. As her car skidded back onto the slick highway, Clara glanced at the passenger seat. Her veins turned to ice. Sitting neatly on the worn leather was a new photograph. A photograph of her, taken from inside her bedroom. Clara drove the entire night, the rain blurring the highway into streaks of silver and black, her heart thrumming like a trapped bird. The photograph on her passenger seat seemed to breathe, the edges curling slightly, as if warm fingers pressed against the paper from inside. She couldn't bring herself to touch it. Every time her eyes flicked toward it, she swore she saw herself blink. Not her, the her inside the photo. That woman, frozen in her own bedroom, looked out with a blank stare that flickered once with something else. Awareness. A sly kind of knowing. By dawn, Clara pulled into a motel off Route 1, the kind of place that smelled faintly of bleach and mildew, its neon vacancy sign buzzing weakly in the gray light. She carried only her bag and locked the photograph in the glove box, though her gut whispered it wouldn't matter. She shut herself into the small room with its faded curtains and musty carpet, collapsing on the bed. Exhaustion finally dragged her into shallow, feverish sleep. When she woke, it was dusk again. The air in the room had changed. Heavy, pressed down on her chest. She sat up, pulse racing, and her stomach turned to stone. The photograph lay neatly on the nightstand beside her. She hadn't touched the glove box. The car was locked. Yet here it was, waiting for her like a loyal pet. Her own face stared back from the glossy paper, but now there was something different. The photo had shifted slightly. Her head turned a fraction, her eyes no longer empty but watching the camera with direct, chilling intensity. Clara pressed a hand to her mouth to stifle a cry. She shoved the photo into the drawer of the nightstand, slammed it shut, and backed into the bathroom, splashing cold water on her face. "Get a grip," she whispered to her reflection. But her reflection didn't soothe her. It only deepened her fear because for the briefest moment she thought she saw another face peering over her shoulder in the mirror. A pale woman's face, the farmhouse woman. Her smile, faint and cruel, brushing against Clara's sanity like a razor's edge. The knock on the door nearly stopped her heart. 3 short raps, crisp and deliberate. Clara froze. No one knew she was here. The knock came again. Shakier this time, she forced herself toward the door, pressing her eye to the peephole. Empty. No one stood outside. Just the buzzing neon light and the wet asphalt of the parking lot. Her hand trembled as she reached for the chain lock, then thought better of it. She backed away. That's when the closet door across the room creaked open. Clara spun. Her breath hitched. A sliver of darkness yawned between the closet door and the frame. She was certain she had shut it earlier. She took a step closer, her legs wooden, every instinct in her body screaming to run. From the shadows within, she heard it. A faint shuffle, like shoes dragging against carpet. And then, silence. She bolted, snatched her bag, tore out of the room, and sprinted into the rain-slick parking lot. She didn't stop until she reached her car, fumbling with the keys, throwing herself inside, locking every door. Her chest burned with terror. That's when she saw them. 3 figures stood at the far edge of the lot, beneath the sputtering neon light. Still as statues, watching. The boy with slicked back hair, the man in the wide hat, and the farmhouse woman. Clara's blood turned to ice. They weren't photographs anymore. They were here. Tall, thin, their bodies smeared at the edges as though reality itself hadn't finished forming them. Their faces were pale, their eyes black wells of hunger. They didn't move, but she knew. They were waiting for her. Clara slammed the car into gear and sped off, tires screeching against the wet pavement. In her rearview mirror, the figures didn't chase her. They didn't need to. They only stood there, shrinking into the distance, until the rain swallowed them whole. Hours later, she reached her apartment, too shaken to think of anywhere else to go. She triple-locked the door, shoved a chair under the knob, and collapsed against the wall, trembling. But as she stumbled into her bedroom, exhaustion tugging at her bones, something stopped her cold. The photographs were everywhere, not just in her closet, not in a neat stack. They covered the walls. Every inch of plaster was plastered with faces. Men, women, children, hundreds of eyes staring out at her, unblinking. Some pressed so close to the camera, it looked as if their noses brushed the glass. Some smiling faintly. Others screaming silently, their mouths open in frozen horror. Her head spun. She clutched her temples, backing into the corner. No, this isn't real. But it was. because when she turned toward the mirror above her dresser, she saw herself reflected. Only her reflection wasn't moving in sync. The Clara in the mirror blinked a second too late. And then, she smiled. The sound came next. A soft rustle like paper tearing, echoing all around her. Clara turned. One of the photographs peeled itself from the wall, fluttering to the ground. Another followed. And then another. From the crumpled pile on the floor, something stirred. Fingers, long, gray, impossibly thin, slid out from beneath the paper. A hand pressing against the floorboards, dragging a body upward. The farmhouse woman crawled free first. Her smile wider now, eyes locked on Clara with a predator's patience. Behind her, others began to stir, their forms bending, tearing, slipping through from glossy stillness into breathing shadow. The photographs weren't just watching anymore. They were opening. Clara staggered backward, tears streaming, her breath ragged. She grabbed the nearest object, a lamp, and hurled it at the creeping figures. The bulb shattered, plunging the room into darkness. But the shapes kept coming, their pale outlines visible in the faint glow of streetlight through the blinds. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, like marionettes yanked by invisible strings. Clara screamed, clutching at the last shred of reason, and fled into the hallway. But as she turned, she stopped cold. Pinned to the wall at the end of the corridor was a fresh photograph. Her, standing exactly where she stood now, and in the photograph, something was reaching for her shoulder. Clara stood frozen in the hallway, the stale air pressing down on her chest as if the very walls were conspiring to suffocate her. Her eyes locked on the photograph nailed to the far end of the corridor. It showed her body, small and fragile, standing exactly where she stood now. Every detail perfect, down to the trembling hands at her sides and the wet strands of hair plastered to her face. But what chilled her blood was not her likeness. It was what hovered just behind her in the photo. A hand, long, skeletal, with nails that looked more like talons, rested lightly on her shoulder. And in the photo, she was not screaming or fleeing. She was smiling, her head whipped around, her body twisting in blind panic. The hallway behind her was empty. No hand, no figure, just shadows crawling lazily across the peeling wallpaper. But the knowledge clawed at her chest. Whatever had placed its hand on her in the photograph was coming. Slowly, inevitably. Her legs jolted into motion, carrying her back into the bedroom, where the pile of photographs still twitched on the floor like a nest of living paper. The farmhouse woman was halfway free, her long hair dragging over the floorboards, her lips moving as though whispering words too faint to hear. Behind her, shapes pushed and writhed, straining to crawl through the glossy barrier of their prison. Clara staggered backward, her foot crunching on a broken shard of glass from the shattered lamp. The sound made the writhing figures pause. Dozens of eyes snapped toward her in unison. No. Her voice cracked, a plea to no one, to anything that might listen. This isn't real, this isn't real. The farmhouse woman tilted her head, her smile spreading into something monstrous. And then Clara heard it, her own voice. Not from her throat, but from the woman's mouth. The mimicry was perfect, the same pitch, the same shaky cadence. This isn't real, the farmhouse woman repeated, mocking her like a cruel echo. Clara's stomach lurched as bile rose to her throat. She bolted down the hall, past the cursed photograph, past the walls that seemed to pulse with hundreds of unseen heartbeats. She reached the front door, yanked at the locks, her trembling hands barely able to grip the metal chain. But when she flung the door open, her hope collapsed. There was no street outside, no city, no world, only an expanse of black void, stretching endlessly in every direction. The door opened not to safety but to nothingness, a hungry emptiness that seemed to lean closer, eager to swallow her whole. Clara slammed the door shut, chest heaving, vision swimming with tears. She was trapped, not in her apartment, not in the motel, not even in the farmhouse where this all began. She was trapped in the photographs themselves. The thought hit her like a physical blow. She stumbled backward, her spine pressing against the door, shaking her head in denial. But the pieces clicked together with merciless precision. The photographs weren't just cursed images. They were doorways, portals, and somewhere along the way, maybe the moment she first touched that photo in the farmhouse, maybe the moment she saw herself blink inside the picture, she had stepped across the threshold without even knowing. She hadn't been escaping them. She had been sinking deeper, frame by frame, into their world. Her knees buckled, and she slid to the floor, gasping like a drowning woman. Around her, the walls began to ripple. The wallpaper peeled itself back in long strips, revealing not plaster, but rows of glossy photographs, each one pulsing faintly, as if they were alive. She crawled forward, drawn despite herself, and peered into one. It showed a girl, no more than 10 years old, sitting on the edge of a bed. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, but when Clara leaned closer, the girl's lips moved. "Help me," the faint voice breathed, barely audible through the paper barrier. Clara's heart cracked with pity and terror. She reached out a trembling hand before jerking it back. She couldn't help them. She couldn't even help herself. Behind her, the farmhouse woman's laughter unfurled, low and guttural, vibrating through the floor. Clara turned to see her fully emerged now, standing tall in the center of the room. Her body seemed unfinished, parts of her still smudged, as though the photograph hadn't fully let go of her. Her eyes glowed like coals buried deep in ash. "You belong here," the woman whispered, though her lips hardly moved. The voice came from everywhere, from the very walls. "We've been waiting, all of us." Clara staggered to her feet, her mind clawing for reason. "Why me?" she screamed, her voice raw. "Why are you doing this?" The woman tilted her head, as if the question were strange. Her smile thinned. "Someone must take the picture." The words sliced through Clara, sharp and cold. Someone must take the picture. The realization seeped into her bones. These souls weren't merely trapped. They were replaced. Each photograph was a vessel, a stolen life. And the woman, the boy, the man, they had once been victims too. Until they weren't. Until they became something else. Something hungry. And now it was her turn. The farmhouse woman raised a hand, and the air around Clara thickened, pressing against her like invisible chains. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The woman stepped closer, her face inches from Clara's, and Clara saw the reflection of herself in those burning black eyes. Only it wasn't really her. It was the version from the photograph, the smiling one, the willing one. The woman's cold fingers grazed Clara's cheek, and Clara's body convulsed with violent shivers. In her mind's eye, she saw it. A new photograph, developing slowly in the dark. Her face forming, her smile curling, her eyes hollowing out. "No!" The scream tore out of her throat with primal desperation. Summoning the last of her strength, Clara wrenched her body sideways, tearing free from the unseen grip, and stumbled toward the pile of photographs on the floor. They pulsed and hissed, dozens of voices rising in protest, but she dug her nails into them, ripping, tearing, shredding, until glossy paper confetti littered the boards. The world screamed with her. The walls shook, the ceiling cracked, the void outside the door howled like a storm. The farmhouse woman staggered, her form glitching, her body breaking into fragments of shadow and light. For a fleeting second, Clara thought she had done it, that she had broken the chain. But then she looked down, at her hands. They weren't hers anymore. The skin was too pale, too smooth, too glossy, like paper. Her veins weren't veins. They were cracks, jagged and dark, splitting her wrists. She staggered backward, horror consuming her as realization struck like lightning. She hadn't destroyed the photographs. She had destroyed herself. The farmhouse woman's smile widened into something triumphant, her body reforming, solidifying. "Someone must take the picture," she whispered again, her voice like a lullaby in the storm. And Clara understood. The photographs hadn't wanted to kill her. They had wanted to keep her, to use her, to make her part of their endless gallery of souls. The last thing she saw before darkness swallowed her was the flash of a camera, blinding, merciless, and her own face, smiling back. For a long time there was nothing. No light, no sound, no body to call her own. Clara floated in a blackness so complete it pressed against her mind like damp cotton. Her thoughts unraveled, memories scattered like ashes in wind. She tried to cling to something, her name, her apartment, the smell of coffee in the morning, the sound of her mother's laugh, but everything slipped through her grasp. Then slowly, the darkness bled into color, a faint red glow, a hiss, like fluid dripping in a dark room. And suddenly she understood. She was inside the process, the developing of the photograph. Her new body was not flesh but film, paper and chemical. Her soul had been printed, her life transcribed in silver halide and shadow. She screamed, but no sound came out. Instead, the scream curled into a smile. Her smile, stamped forever on the glossy surface of the photograph. Outside, in the motel room that no longer belonged to her, the trunk sat silently in the corner. The photographs that had once spilled across the floor were stacked neatly inside, as though nothing had ever been disturbed. At the top of the pile, still damp and smelling faintly of chemical ink, lay a new image. Clara. She looked perfect, radiant, her hair smoothed, her eyes locked on the camera, her lips curled in a knowing smile. But there was something wrong, something no human could miss if they stared long enough. Her eyes weren't still. They shimmered with the faintest trace of movement, glancing sideways when no one looked, following shadows across the room. And from within, Clara was aware. She felt the presence of the others around her, the souls in the neighboring photographs, dozens of them, hundreds. Whispers filled the darkness of her mind, overlapping, constant. They did not comfort, they did not converse. They were just there, watching. She began to understand what the farmhouse woman had meant. Someone must take the picture. The curse was never random. It was a cycle, a system. The photographs did not just trap souls. They preserved them, archived them, like specimens pinned to a collector's wall. And each victim was both prisoner and lure, waiting for the next unsuspecting hand to lift the trunk's lid. Days later, the motel manager knocked on the door. Clara hadn't checked out, and the room had been paid only through the weekend. After several unanswered knocks, he slid the master key into the lock. The room was empty, too empty. The sheets were tucked tight, the lamp replaced, the window spotless. There was no sign anyone had ever stayed there except for the heavy trunk in the corner. The manager frowned, curious, and walked over. The trunk was beautiful in its way. Old oak wood, brass hinges, edges worn smooth with time. He crouched, brushed the dust from its lid and lifted it. Inside lay the stack of photographs. He shuffled through them, smiling faintly at the odd collection. Old portraits, faded family snapshots, sepia-toned couples who had long since crumbled to dust. He turned one over. It had no writing, no year, just a pale face staring out at him. He paused. The eyes. Something about them made him tilt the photograph in the light. He swore the woman in the picture, Clara, though he could never know her name, had just blinked. The hairs on the back of his neck rose. He laughed nervously and set the photo aside, shaking his head at his own imagination. He closed the trunk, locked the door, and left. But Clara knew. From inside her glossy prison she felt him, the way his hand lingered on her frame, the way his pupils dilated when the flicker of movement caught his eye. He had noticed her, even for just a second. And that was all it would take. Sooner or later, curiosity would bring him back. He would open the trunk again, linger too long, stare too deep. And then the cycle would continue. Clara no longer measured time in hours or days. She measured it in glances. Every time someone's eyes passed over her photograph, she felt it like heat against her skin. and the longer they stared, the stronger she became. She waited, biding her time, smiling outward while screaming inward. The whispers of the other trapped souls filled her ears, a choir of endless torment. Some begged for release. Others laughed in madness. A few whispered secrets about the photographer, the man who had started it all. Clara pieced fragments together. His obsession with immortality, his belief that photographs could hold not just likeness but essence. He had succeeded, but at a cost. He was no longer a man. He was the camera itself, the lens, the flash, the act of capturing. His curse had outlived him. A self-sustaining hunger passed through every frame. And now Clara was part of it. Forever. Weeks later, a teenage girl rummaging through her grandmother's attic would stumble across a beautiful old trunk. She would brush off the dust, giggle at the strange old photographs, and pause on one picture in particular. A woman with long hair, staring directly into the lens. The girl would tilt her head, frowning. "Weird," she would mutter. Her eyes look like they're moving. And if you, listening now, ever find yourself staring at an old photograph, wondering for just a second if the eyes are following you, don't look too long. Because in that moment, the photograph isn't just watching you, it's waiting for you. And when it has you, no matter how far you run, it will never let you go.